Hello guys, and welcome to Season 2, Episode 3, Turning Point with Bella and Nigol. Hi guys, and welcome back to the Inked Podcast. Today we are touching on our next point down our road of plot, and that is the turning point. Here to help me break this down today is Miss Bella Nigol. So how are you doing today, Miss Bella?
I am great.
Well, that's awesome. I'm really glad you're doing great.
Okay, pause real quick. Sorry.
Go ahead.
So it's actually pronounced Nigel.
That's
I
totally
know
fine.
that's very
Normally,
confusing,
I would
and
ask.
I already knew it was going to be confusing for everybody. So
Yeah, no, you're fine. I have said so many people's last names wrong and like the names of their stories wrong, and I've just accepted this point that yeah.
no, literally same. So
Yeah. So for those of you guys who are not familiar with who Bella is a Christian homeschooled author who writes stories that teach about Christ-centered relationships, how to trust God when it's hard, and how to forgive as Jesus forgave. She has over a decade of writing experience and enjoys writing everything from sci-fi to romance. Currently, she is working on 4 novels, a science fiction mystery titled Abernathy, a Cinderella retelling from the prince's point of view called The Glass Prince, and a fantasy novel about scribes and sheep dragons. Bella has a short story about love and loss published in an anthology called Tell Your Heart to Beat Again by the Skillful Pen Press. When she's not coming up with her obsessive story ideas, you can find her reading any good book out there, playing with her chickens, or cooking and baking something that's bound to make your mouth water. So, Bella, are you ready to dive into today's topic?
absolutely.
So, we have talked a lot about different points of plot thus far on the podcast, especially in this season of the show. But today we are talking about the turning point. And the turning point is something that is very important in our stories, but I'm not going to go too much into it because that is for Bella to answer our very first question of what is the turning point?
So the turning point is also known as the inciting incident, and it is my favorite part of a story because it's when a character is finally going to get the story rolling. So obviously before that, you have to establish what normal life is and all that, and it's like, well, what's next? What's going to change? And that is where the turning point comes in. And I really love it because it's like all the suspense is kind of building up, and then it's like something finally happens. So at this point, we've already established what normal life is, and it's finally time to change things. It's also referred to as the point of no return because either something happened or changed in the story, or the character has come to a realization that they can't move on from. So they like figured something out and they just can't like forget about it. They have to do something. An example of that is when Katniss Everdeen from the Hunger Games volunteers as tribute, like for her sister.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I definitely agree. That's a great way to explain it, first of all. Another way to think about it, this is kind of just piggybacking off what Bella just said, but another way you can think about it is it's the moment that your character makes the choice that'll change things forever. So, like, it's that fork in the road where they have to pick one way or the other. Am I going to be a hero or am I going to be a villain? Am I going to save this person or am I not? Am I going to go off and join in a war or am I not? Am I going to stay in my comfort zone or am I going to jump into something new? It's just, yeah, it's like one of the coolest points in our stories because it's when our characters really decide what they're going to do with their lives.
For sure, yeah.
Okay. So our next question, I have told Miss Bella that she can relate this to her story however she would like, because our next question is, what is the overall effect of your turning point?
So I'm going to give a little example of the turning point in my story. So in my story is when it happens when the villain that's in charge of the asylum recruits the main character to spy on the rest of the kids in the asylum. So instead of living, so this is what changes the story. Instead of living her life at the asylum like she had been, she's now decided to escape. without this turning point, this story would have just been about this character's miserable life at an asylum. So if she hadn't have decided to escape after she'd been recruited to spy, then this story would have just been the normal everyday life. There wouldn't have been anything new about it. It wouldn't you couldn't get to the rest of the big points in a story.
Hmm. So yeah, the turning point is that launching pad for your story. Without that moment of choice, without that like base starting point, your character wouldn't have gone anywhere. So thus, like the story wouldn't have progressed. You would have had like a bland story that people wouldn't necessarily want to read. So I think that the turning point can highly be attributed to the success of our stories.
Yeah, for sure.
So our next question, again, I told her she can relate this to her story because she has a lot of great examples of these things. But our next question is how does the turning point directly affect your character?
So, my main character knew that the head of the asylum was a villain, but she believed that if she did what he said, she would be allowed to leave the asylum, like she would be set free. So, that is the external turning point because it was a turning point outside of her hands. She didn't really have a choice if she could spy on the kids or not. And so, but then there is an internal turning point as well.
Mm-hmm.
So at first, she just is thinking about herself. She's like, I'm going to do this and then I can leave. But then as she gets, closer in relationship to these other characters, she has an internal turning point where she realizes that they need to all escape. She needs to figure out how to get everyone to be able to leave. And that's also an internal turning point. A lot of the times you just have one or the other. It's not both, but I like to complicate things, so I did both.
Yeah. So yeah, definitely that makes sense. And that's a great example of that because your character is the reason that the turning point happens most of the time
Yeah,
because they have this moment of choice. They have to decide exactly what they're going to do with their lives. And oftentimes it changes who they are on the inside. So, like their
yeah.
morals, their values, everything changes when they make that moment of choice. So, that was a great example of that. So, going into our next question of the day, which is we've kind of already answered this a little bit, but why is the turning point so important in a story?
It's the first step of a story because without it you just have this story of everyday life and people don't really like to read that. They want to read something with twists and plot turns and all that kind of stuff, and that's like the first plot twist, the first turn in the story, so that you can go in the direction that you want.
Hmm. It's that first step from exposition into so exposition, you have rising action, which we've talked about, and then that turning point will lead to your climax. So
Yeah.
without your turning point, you're not going to have your climax, which is like the biggest part of your story.
Yeah, I think it's so worded so perfectly because you're going in a certain direction and then you have a turning point where you actually turn so that you could go in the direction of the next step. Because without that turn, you'd be going in the wrong direction. You couldn't get to that next step.
Yeah. So I've said before the whole thing about the turning point affecting the character's morals. So how
Yeah.
going into another question, this is one I thought off the top of my head. Going into our next question, which is just like how heavily do you think the turning point affects the character?
Mm, I think it probably depends on the storyline and the character, but I think it affects it pretty heavily. I mean, it changes their lives
Mm-hmm.
because it sets them going into a different direction. They probably don't even know what their life is going to be like after that. They don't know
Mm-hmm.
what's going to change, and I think it probably changes a lot.
Yeah, I think it becomes such a big internal conflict that like the character's like I've made this decision and now I have to live with the consequences of that decision.
For sure.
Whether
And all the decisions that come after it too, cuz
Mhm.
new things will pop up and
Yeah, That's definitely really true because like you think, okay, they made this decision. If I go to war, I'm thinking about one of my current characters. He gets
Yeah,
drafted into war, and so he
yeah,
makes that decision. Okay, I'm actually gonna go. Like I feel
yeah,
like I should go, and so he does. But then there's so many decisions after that. He's
yeah.
like, do I save my friend? Like, do I
Mm-hmm.
go back home to be with my family because
Yeah.
they need me, or do I stay here with like these men who have become my brothers?
Yeah, well, the first question, it's just the first question. The first question for him would have been, if I go to war, like I'll live or die. It
Mhm.
wasn't like all the questions afterwards because he didn't know about those. So
Yeah.
it leads to so much more that, our characters don't even know about,
Hmm. That choice that they made can affect what questions they ask themselves in the future.
for sure.
So, like, that I feel like changes the morals a lot. Because going back to this character, he's like my biggest example of a turning point.
Yeah.
Um, because if he had stayed home, he would have been like, what am I doing with my life? Why aren't I
Hmm.
doing more with myself? Like,
Yeah.
is being here and working on this farm enough for me? Um, and so I think, yeah, I think it's the turning point is definitely such a valued and important part of a story because without that, your story would not progress.
Yeah. It's my favorite part, and some people say it's the most important part, and I can see that.
Yeah. The more that we're like sitting here talking about it, I'm kind of realizing how important it really is to a
Yeah.
story. Because if
Yeah.
you don't have that, you're not going to have really a story.
Yeah,
Like,
well,
you can't
mhm.
have exposition and then, like, you're having your normal life and then, boom, like, okay, I'm in a climax. What happened
Right.
between
There's
the
just this big
exposition
jump
and this climax? What happened in between this for
for
me to end up?
sure.
So I feel like it closes that gap of wondering, what am I doing here? How did this middle section just disappear?
It does for sure, yeah.
Well, that is all of the time that we have for today. So thank you, Miss Bella, for being here. I'm really glad you could come on.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
And as always, thank you to our listeners for being here for yet another episode of the Ange Podcast, and we will see you in the next episode. Bye, guys.